"You're an embarrassment. Don't even think about showing up," my dad said before my sister's graduation. But when I walked in anyway, her professor turned to me and said, "Well done, CEO." The room went silent, and that's when their true faces showed. I, 28 never thought I'd be standing in a university auditorium watching my family's faces crumble. But life has a funny way of serving justice when you least expect it. Growing up, I was always the disappointment. While my sister excelled in academics and sports, I struggled with dyslexia and barely scraped through high school. Dad never let me forget it. Every family dinner became a comparison session where she was the golden child and I was the cautionary tale. After high school, I didn't go to college. Instead, I started working odd jobs, delivery driver, warehouse worker, anything that paid the bills. Dad made sure everyone knew his son was a failure. At family gatherings, he'd introduce my sister as the future doctor and me as still figuring things out. What they didn't know was that during those late-night delivery shifts, I was teaching myself coding. Every spare moment between jobs, I was learning programming languages, building websites, creating apps. While they slept, I was grinding. 3 years ago, I launched a small tech startup from my cramped apartment. It was just me and a laptop, solving problems for local businesses. The work was brutal, 18-hour days, living on instant noodles, but something was building. I kept it quiet. After years of being called a failure, I wasn't ready to share my small victories. Besides, the business was still fragile, and I couldn't handle their skepticism crushing what little confidence I'd built. The breakthrough came 18 months ago. A major corporation noticed our software solution and wanted to acquire us. The negotiation process was intense, but when the dust settled, I walked away with enough money to never worry about finances again. More importantly, they offered me the CEO position of their new tech division. I still didn't tell my family. The wounds from years of criticism ran too deep. I moved to a better apartment, bought decent clothes, but kept my success private. They assumed I was still struggling, and I let them believe it. Last month, my sister was graduating with her master's degree in business administration. The whole family was buzzing with excitement. She'd landed a prestigious internship and was already talking about her bright future. 2 days before the ceremony, Dad called me. His voice carried that familiar tone of disappointment mixed with irritation. He told me the graduation was a big day for the family, that important people would be there, and that I shouldn't embarrass them by showing up looking like a failure. His exact words hit me like a punch to the gut. He said I was an embarrassment and shouldn't even think about showing up. He mentioned that my sister's professors and potential employers would be there, and my presence might reflect poorly on the family. I sat in my office. Yes, my corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt that familiar sting of rejection. But this time, something was different. I wasn't the same broken kid who used to cry himself to sleep after Dad's lectures. I made a decision that would change everything. Graduation day arrived, and I dressed carefully, not in my usual casual clothes, but in the tailored suit I wore to board meetings. I drove my Tesla, the one my family had never seen, to the university. The auditorium was packed with proud families. I spotted my parents and extended family in the third row, all dressed up and beaming with pride. They hadn't noticed me yet. I found a seat in the back and watched the ceremony unfold. My sister looked radiant in her cap and gown, and despite everything, I felt proud of her achievements. She'd worked hard for this moment. After the formal ceremony, there was a reception where graduates mingled with faculty and families. I watched from a distance as my parents introduced my sister to various professors and industry professionals. That's when I noticed him, Professor Martinez, the head of the business school. I recognized him immediately because his department had been one of our biggest clients for the past year. We'd developed a comprehensive management software system for their graduate program. He was talking to my sister when his eyes found mine across the room. His face lit up with recognition, and he started walking toward me. The room seemed to slow down as he approached. My family was still clustered around my sister, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Professor Martinez reached me and extended his hand with a warm smile. He congratulated me on the recent expansion of our company and mentioned how impressed the university had been with our work. Then, in a voice that carried across the nearby conversations, he said something that would shatter my family's perception forever. He called me CEO and thanked me for the innovative solutions we provided to the business school. He mentioned how our software had revolutionized their program management and how other universities were now requesting similar systems. The conversations around us gradually died down. I could see heads turning, including my family's. My parents' faces went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like panic. My sister was the first to approach. Her face was pale, and she asked if what the professor said was true. I confirmed that yes, I was the CEO of the tech company that had been working with the university. The questions came flooding then. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I told them? What exactly did my company do? I explained, calmly and without emotion, that I'd built the company from nothing over the past few years. I mentioned the acquisition, the expansion, and my current role. I kept my voice steady, professional, the same tone I used in boardrooms. Dad's face had gone through several color changes. He asked why I'd kept this secret, and I reminded him of his phone call 2 days ago. I repeated his exact words about me being an embarrassment and not showing up. The silence that followed was deafening. Other families nearby had stopped their conversations to listen. My extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins who'd witnessed years of my humiliation, stood frozen. Mom tried to salvage the situation by saying they'd always believed in me, but I gently corrected her. I reminded her of the countless dinners where my failures were discussed in detail, the family gatherings where I was introduced as the disappointment. My sister, to her credit, looked genuinely shocked and hurt. She said she'd never known I was being treated so differently, but I reminded her of the conversations she'd been part of, the comparisons that had been made. Professor Martinez, sensing the family tension, tried to lighten the mood by mentioning how proud they must be of my achievements. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. That's when the real show began. Dad suddenly became the proud father, telling Professor Martinez how he'd always known I had potential. He started claiming credit for my work ethic and determination. Mom joined in, talking about how they'd supported my unconventional path. I watched this performance with detached fascination. These were the same people who'd spent years making me feel worthless, now trying to bask in reflected glory. My uncle, who'd made countless jokes about my lack of direction, suddenly wanted to discuss business opportunities. My cousin, who'd always looked down on me, was asking about job openings at my company. The transformation was both pathetic and revealing. Their true faces were showing, not the disappointment and shame they'd expressed for years, but naked opportunism and social climbing. I remained polite but distant. When Dad suggested we all go to dinner to celebrate both graduations, mine and my sister's, I declined. I had work to do, I told them, which was true. As I prepared to leave, my sister pulled me aside. She apologized for not standing up for me over the years and admitted she'd been so focused on her own success that she'd ignored how I was being treated. Her apology felt genuine, unlike the performance our parents were putting on. I told her I was proud of her graduation and that my issues weren't with her directly, but with the family dynamic that had made me invisible unless I was being criticized. Update 1. The days following the graduation were interesting, to say the least. My phone, which had been relatively quiet from family calls over the years, suddenly became very active. Dad called first, wanting to have a man-to-man conversation about my success. He suggested we meet for lunch to discuss how proud he was and how he'd always seen my potential. The conversation felt surreal. This was the same man who'd told me not to embarrass the family just days earlier. I agreed to meet him, curious to see how far this charade would go. We met at an upscale restaurant downtown. Dad arrived in his best suit, clearly trying to make an impression. He spent the first 20 minutes talking about how he'd always believed in unconventional paths to success and how my journey proved his point. I listened without interrupting, fascinated by this revisionist history. When he finished his speech, I asked him directly about the phone call before graduation. His face flushed, and he claimed he'd been protecting me from potential embarrassment, not knowing about my success. Then came the real purpose of the lunch. He started talking about his retirement plans and how he'd always dreamed of starting a small business. He mentioned how valuable my experience and connections would be for someone in his position. I realized he was asking for money and business opportunities without actually asking directly. The man who'd called me an embarrassment was now trying to figure out how to profit from my success. I kept my response professional. I told him that my company had strict policies about family involvement and that mixing business with personal relationships rarely worked out well. His disappointment was visible, but he tried to hide it behind forced understanding. Mom called next, wanting to plan a family dinner to properly celebrate my achievements. She suggested inviting extended family and some of their friends who worked in business. The dinner she was planning sounded more like a networking event than a family celebration. I declined, explaining that I preferred to keep my professional and personal lives separate. She seemed confused by this boundary, as if my success was now family property to be displayed and leveraged. The most telling call came from my uncle, Dad's brother, who'd spent years making jokes about my lack of direction at family gatherings. He wanted to discuss a business proposition and suggested we meet to explore mutually beneficial opportunities. I was curious enough to take the meeting. We met at a coffee shop, and he pitched me on investing in his friend's restaurant venture. He talked about family loyalty and how successful people had obligations to help their relatives achieve their dreams. The irony was staggering. This was the same man who'd laughed when I'd mentioned wanting to start my own business years ago. Now he was lecturing me about family obligations and shared success. I politely declined his investment opportunity and explained that I had a fiduciary responsibility to my company and investors that prevented me from making emotional financial decisions. Update 2. 3 weeks after graduation, the family dynamics had shifted completely, but not in the way anyone expected. My sister reached out again, this time with a more honest conversation. She admitted that watching the family's reaction to my success had opened her eyes to patterns she'd ignored for years. She'd started noticing how differently our parents spoke about us, and how they created a hierarchy that neither of us had questioned. She also mentioned something that surprised me. Apparently, our parents had been telling people at their social gatherings about my success, taking credit for my upbringing, and claiming they'd always supported my entrepreneurial spirit. The narrative they were spinning bore no resemblance to reality. This revelation bothered me more than I expected. It was one thing to privately revise history, but actively spreading false stories felt like a violation. I decided to address this directly. I called a family meeting, something I'd never done before. I asked everyone to come to my apartment, which they'd never seen. The apartment visit was strategic. I wanted them to see the life I'd built without their knowledge or support. The modern furniture, the home office setup, the view of the city, all evidence of a success they'd been completely unaware of. When they arrived, their reactions were predictable. Dad immediately started commenting on the expensive furnishings and prime location. Mom began asking about the cost of rent and whether I owned or leased. They were calculating my worth in real time. I addressed the elephant in the room directly. I told them I'd heard they were sharing stories about my success and taking credit for my upbringing. I explained that this needed to stop immediately. Dad became defensive, claiming that parents naturally felt proud of their children's achievements. I reminded him that pride typically involved supporting someone during their struggles, not just claiming credit after success arrived. The conversation became heated when I brought up specific examples of their lack of support over the years. I mentioned the times I tried to share my small business ideas and been dismissed. I talked about the family gatherings where my struggles were entertainment for others. Mom tried to minimize these incidents, claiming they were just trying to motivate me to do better. I asked her how calling someone an embarrassment was supposed to be motivating. The meeting ended with clear boundaries. I told them that any future relationship would need to be based on honesty about our past, not revisionist history that served their current interests. My sister was the only one who seemed to understand what I was asking for. She acknowledged the family patterns and committed to being more aware of how these dynamics affected everyone involved. Update 3. 2 months later, the dust had settled into a new normal that nobody seemed entirely comfortable with. My parents had largely stopped their public relations campaign about my success, mainly because I'd made it clear that any false narratives would result in complete contact cutoff. They seemed to be struggling with how to relate to me now that their old patterns of criticism and control no longer worked. Dad made one more attempt at reconciliation, this time with what seemed like genuine remorse. He admitted that he'd been harder on me than necessary and that his own insecurities about success had influenced how he treated my struggles. This conversation felt different from his earlier attempts at damage control. He wasn't asking for anything or trying to position himself advantageously. He seemed genuinely troubled by the realization that his behavior had driven me to hide my success from the family. I appreciated his honesty, but I also made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent behavior changes. Years of criticism couldn't be erased by a single conversation, no matter how sincere. Mom took longer to understand the situation. She kept trying to plan family events that would showcase our close relationship to others. She seemed unable to grasp that I wasn't interested in performing family unity for social purposes. The most surprising development came from my extended family. Several relatives who'd witnessed the graduation incident reached out privately to apologize for their past behavior. Apparently, seeing the family dynamics exposed so publicly had made them reflect on their own treatment of me over the years. My cousin, who'd always been particularly condescending, sent a thoughtful message acknowledging how he'd contributed to making family gatherings uncomfortable for me. He didn't ask for anything in return, which made his apology feel genuine. The business world had also taken notice of the family drama, though in unexpected ways. Professor Martinez had mentioned our conversation to colleagues, and word had spread about the CEO who'd been hiding his success from his family. Several business publications reached out for interviews about unconventional paths to success. I declined most of these opportunities, preferring to keep my personal story private. But the attention had led to new business opportunities and partnerships that were genuinely exciting. My sister and I had developed a much more honest relationship. She'd started her new job and was experiencing her own challenges with family expectations. She mentioned feeling pressure to live up to this successful child image our parents had created for her. We began having regular conversations about family dynamics and how to maintain healthy boundaries while still caring about our relatives. She was dealing with her own version of the success burden, the pressure to be perfect rather than the pressure to prove worth. Looking back on that graduation day, I realized that walking into that auditorium despite Dad's warning had been about more than just attending my sister's ceremony. It had been about refusing to remain invisible, about claiming my place in a family that had written me off. The revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't in humiliating them publicly. It was in forcing them to confront the reality of who I'd become despite their lack of support. It was in making them face the consequences of their treatment and the opportunities they'd missed to be part of my journey. The most satisfying part wasn't their shock or embarrassment. It was the realization that I no longer needed their approval or validation. I'd built something meaningful without their help, and their opinion of my worth was no longer relevant to my sense of self. The family relationships were still complicated and probably always would be. But at least now they were based on truth rather than the fiction that I was a failure who needed their guidance to find direction. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to remain the person others expect you to be. Sometimes it's building a life so successful that their criticism becomes irrelevant. And sometimes it's walking into a room where you're not wanted and letting your achievements speak for themselves. The silence in that auditorium when Professor Martinez called me so wasn't just shock. It was the sound of old narratives crumbling and new realities taking their place.